talking about so far, right? So I kind of want to talk about, before we get into the next poems that are going to deal more with the specifics of the mining disaster, kind of like, what's the theoretical background? What should we sort of be thinking critically about in terms of this relationship between humans and the environment while we're reading these poems? So I thought we could kind of compare, because a lot of the representations of this relationship between humans and the environment we've seen so far have been more or less similar. This sort of experience of being in nature, sort of finding some kind of beauty and value in it. But here we have something different. So I want to kind of just brainstorm a little bit and think about what some of those differences are. Or likewise, what some of the similarities are. So we can say we'll have our similar column here and different over here. So what do you guys think? What are some of the differences and similarities? Do you have your hand up? Oh. Well, I think the first one that sort of comes to my mind is that we kind of have gone from dealing with organic nature, right? Things like plants, animals, dirt, these sort of things that grow and change and decompose, to something a little bit different. Because now we're talking about rocks and minerals and all these kind of things that are buried deep in the earth. So we're kind of getting to a different type of nature. But I mean, are those things different? Is there really that strong of a difference between, say, like being in a forest and calling that nature, and looking at things underground and calling those nature? Do you guys think those are the same thing? This sort of gets to this idea that we were talking about at the very, very beginning of the class of how do we even make these lines that separate these things, or should we? And obviously you guys haven't seen as much the kind of environmental health dangers that we're going to see in these poems, but I want to kind of give you some preparation for that, so that when we're reading these, you can see how this is like a slightly different way of relating to the environment, but not totally different. So I think we can say first, we're both dealing with like things that are in the earth, right? And if we think of plants, animals, rocks, it's kind of all there. It's similar, but we're also dealing with things that I think the best way to kind of make this difference is that we're dealing with things that can't change or be transformed as easily. So we can say sort of harder to transform. So like if we think of that in terms of Walt Whitman, I think this might be kind of interesting. Because, basically what the issue is, what happens, and we're going to see this in detail in the poems today, is that these miners are breathing in this silicate dust. And it gets trapped in their lungs, and basically it makes them sick and they can't breathe. We're going to see a lot of the sort of details of how it does that and why in these poems. But this is sort of interesting because, like in Whitman, we see this idea that nature can hurt us, nature can be harmful, but at the same time it has this sort of ability to transfigure it into other things that are not as dangerous or not as harmful. But then we come into kind of problems as we get, especially later into the 20th century, and we have these kind of industries like this, where we start to take things out of the earth that we've never really taken out before, and we start to concentrate them in ways that we haven't done before. So we end up with things that maybe in and of themselves are not dangerous, that just exist. I mean, you think of things like radiation. Naturally, there are some even rocks naturally contain radiation, and that's fine. It still poses a slight health risk to us, but I mean, everything comes with some kind of risk. But then if you think about when you start extracting, like uranium, creating nuclear energy or nuclear weapons, we're taking these things out of the earth that have always been there, but we're putting them into concentrations that have never existed before. And we're exposing ourselves and our bodies to them in ways that we've never done before. So it's this kind of tricky thing that you get. Obviously, Walt Whitman wouldn't have known that in the 1800s. You have some stuff like this. I mean, like people have been using lead for a long time, mercury. I mean, at one point people even thought mercury could be used for longevity, which really is not true, it'll kill you. So I mean, there were some things like this, these sort of poisonous substances coming out of the earth that we had sort of always had around. But at the same time, with this sort of increase in industry and manufacturing, things like chemical processing, which we see into the 20th century and even more so today are kind of changing the way that we have to think about the environment and the earth. And is it really this safe and loving thing, or is it something dangerous? And I mean, we can even take that a little bit further, and after the Thanksgiving break, we'll get into issues around climate change, and kind of talking about how climate change is really sort of the ultimate example of this difficulty in seeing the environment at the same time as sort of the thing that sustains us and keeps us alive, but at the same time is also something that can destroy us. And that those are sort of two, if we want to think of it as kind of two sides of one coin. It kind of complicates our view of what the environment is, what nature is. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should we even call it good or bad? Does nature care? So I think this is just to give us this kind of theoretical background. Does anyone have any other questions or comments or examples that you guys can think of this sort of more complicated relationships where the environment isn't quite that nice and promising thing that we've seen so far? What do you guys think? I mean, when you look, for example, at the rain, do you think, is this just sort of rain coming down, watering the plants, everybody is happy, birds are hopping around in the puddles? Or we could think, well, what's in that water? What is it washing around? I mean, right, when it rains, it also washes all sorts of pollutants and things that get accumulated into the street, go out to the ocean. So there are lots and lots of different ways that we can kind of think of these complicated relationships that make us question whether or not we think the environment is good, or bad, or is helpful or beneficial, or ultimately I don't think we can kind of rest on one side or the other. I think that it's just sort of this push and pull between the two. But I think this is what we're really going to see in these Rutgeiser poems, and what she wants us to get to see is this relationship between, especially our bodies and the environment. So I think that's kind of another thing that'll be useful to talk about before we get into these poems. What do you guys think? How does the environment affect our bodies? Any ideas? Things around you. I mean, the environment doesn't have to be a forest. I mean, this classroom has an environment, right? There's sort of stuffy air in here, and these fluorescent lights, and I mean, all these kind of things, dust, that make up the environment of this classroom. So an environment can be anything that literally, I mean, if we think of it, is sort of around you in the terms of environs, the root of that word. So, for example, we could think of the environment in the case of this tunnel disaster as the inside of the tunnel. That is their environment. So the environment is not, we kind of think of environmentalism. Be friendly to the environment. Care about the environment. When we think of that, it's, we kind of think of the little, I remember like when I was a little kid, there was this polluting and littering commercial on TV that was a little like owl in a forest, little cartoon, very nice, sort of little nature scene. That's what we think of when we think of the environment a lot of the time. But really the environment is just whatever is around us. I mean, if we think of, has anybody seen like pictures from China, how they have all that smog? It's like, you see it, it looks like when it's like foggy around here, except for it's smog. I mean, that's their environment. That's what they're breathing in. And if we think about that, our bodies and the environment are really interrelated in a lot of ways because we take all these things in, we breathe them in. I mean, that's what's happening in the case of these miners. They're breathing in this dust. And what was part of the environment once is now becoming a part of their body. And it's becoming a part of their lungs and affecting their ability to breathe. So then we kind of have to question, is there really that strong of a difference between the environment and our body? And how are all the different ways that things can sort of pass through our bodies, through the environment? Think of the things that we eat, what we put into our bodies. Like, does anybody know about like tuna? All the problems with mercury in tuna? Somebody who would like to tell us about it? Any guilty sushi fans? I know, I always like feel bad about it because it looks so good. I see, oh, look at this piece of tuna. It looks great. It tastes good. I can't see any mercury in it. I can't taste any mercury in it. But I know, nevertheless, that if I'm eating it, it's potentially I'm introducing these things into my body. And, whatever other chemicals might be in it, right? Because do people know how tuna gets all that mercury in it? How it accumulates it? Anybody? So tuna, and these other big fish, right? Because tuna can be like 1,200 pounds. They're eating all these fish that are eating all these fish that are, so on and so on until, so basically, you have the smallest fish who start accumulating things in their bodies. They get eaten by the bigger ones and the bigger ones and the bigger ones. And by the time they reach the tuna, you have these big fish who have accumulated because their bodies are large enough. They've accumulated a lot of these contaminants within their bodies. And so when the biggest fish in the ocean eat them, they're getting the highest concentration of those things. Which is why it's, for example, really safe to eat. I like anchovies, the stinky little sardines, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they smell kind of bad. I think they smell good. But they're much safer to eat because they're not getting all these contaminants to them. So there are all these sorts of ways that human bodies, animal bodies, all kinds of different bodies are affected by the environment. So anyway, I guess we didn't end up putting very much up here. But hopefully this gives you guys kind of a good idea of what's going on and what Muriel Rukeyser wants us to see in these relationships. So, okay, if someone wants to get the lights, I'd like to go over another one of the poems now. Before we start, does anybody have any other questions about any of the poem that we looked at last on Monday or anything else? That one I think is good because it's giving us this sort of historical background. But now we're going to be moving forward. We're going to be moving forward in time a little bit more. Because the last poem, I mean, we started off in the 1670s, and then we went to the Civil War, and then we kind of made our way up to the 1930s when this power plants and stuff are being built. So now we're going to be in roughly the 1930s, right? Remember, this was published in 1938. Let's see. I don't know why this isn't showing up. Yeah. So yeah, reminder: papers due Friday. Also, I know some people had emailed me about looking over your papers. I think at this point for the last two papers, I'm not going to give you guys any commentary, mostly just because I think you guys have been doing a good job overall, and I think you can do it on your own at this point. I have faith in you guys. But if you have any questions, if you want to talk about it, I have office hours from 12:30 to 1:30 today after class. So, I mean, anything you want to talk about, I'm more than happy to talk about your papers with you. But for the next two, for this one and the last one, I won't give you guys any feedback beforehand. But, of course, if you have questions, come to office hours. Don't know why this is not working. I had it set up earlier, and I should not have unplugged it. Let's see. Ah, there we go. Okay. All right, so I want to do the same thing that we did last time and just read through this together. So let's start on this side of the classroom this time. So Sai, if you'd like to start us off, and then we'll loop back around here and just however it makes sense to go. So just everybody read a line. Don't worry if you can't pronounce things. It's fine. There's some strange medical words in here, so just, I probably can't even pronounce some of these. Do your best. All right, let's get started.
This is a lung disease, so fate dust that makes it the death causes the growth of it.
This is the X-ray picture taken last evening.
I would point out to you, these are the ribs.
This is a region of breastbone.
This is the heart, a wide shoulder.
In here, of course, is the swallowing tube esophagus. The lymphatic spaces between the ribs.
Between the ribs, these are the collarbones.
Now this lungs motor beginning in this area.
And say if thunderstorm has struck the fellow's lungs.
About a light that side and this side, top and bottom.
The first stage in this period in this case.
Does have the same.
All right, we're
Come to the window again. Here's the heart.
When you snatches the first scene of the list. You will notice some disappearance of his indication. That indicates the progress in someone's time. And now this here is short, beating solid stars. Even over the lips they have been sides.
whoever wants to go back there, just conglomeration.
Let's see. Third stage, each time I close my hands dear and dear and dear and dear. It is growing worse every day at night. Flat on my back until we have a breath. It gradually shows off the hair cells in the lungs.
All right, let's come back around. So we're at, I am trying to say best I can right here.
I am trying to say the best I can. This is what happens, isn't it?
The choking off in hair cells.
Yes, there is difficulty in breathing.
Yes, and a painful cough.
Yes, this silicone is causing death.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Great job, guys. Give yourselves a round of applause. Okay. So before we kind of go more in depth into this, what do you guys think? What are your sort of first impressions or things that are confusing, questions you might have? Yeah. Right, yeah. So it's they mentioned in the very beginning the silicate dust. So this is talking about the stuff that they're breathing in. Anything else? Did I see any other hands out there? I mean, this is a little bit different from the poem that we looked at on Monday, right? It has a kind of different tone. How do you guys think that this is different or similar? I mean, there's sort of, oh yeah.
Is it someone that is in the mind talking?
Yeah, so okay, so this is a good question. Like who's, oh, sorry, keep going.
Because if it is technically with a complete sexual disorder, or my name is a different girl and I wrote it, but that was like more based on like facts and like Britain, but this is more like someone's that did it.
Right, so I mean, this is someone speaking out loud and kind of giving a testimony. So, and right, you mentioned, again, the last one we saw, there were kind of several different voices. So let's just, okay, before we even get too deep into this, who do we think, who are the people talking here? Because there's a couple different people, yeah.
It seems like it could be like a doctor, where they say like a
Right, so there's kind of medical things, so okay. What else? I mean, it's not necessarily given in the poem who's talking here. Who else, what might this conversation be? We could think it's between a doctor and a patient. What else could it be? Any other ideas? Well, the other thing that we'll see in here is some of these things are testimony that are given in court. So they're trying to make a case against the mining company to prove that they basically poisoned these people. So I think some of this is, obviously this is a doctor, I believe that this is a doctor questioning a miner in court. So they're trying to sort of prove that the mining company is responsible for this disease, that they're responsible for killing these people because they put them into this dangerous environment without any protection. And I mean, that was another thing that I thought was interesting. Remember in the video that we watched on Monday, how they mentioned that there were they brought in a lot of African American and non-union laborers to do this job. So think again about the union workers in Grapes of Wrath. Why would that be? Why might they want to do that? Bring in non-union workers. Yeah. Cheaper wages, right? I mean, why would they take cheaper wages than say union workers?
Because they can hire a lot more people with cheaper wages. It's like if you have a union worker, they're gonna demand more. So and then you're gonna hire less people. So supply and demand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, right, because the unions, the reason that these people have unions is, like you say, so they can demand more, they can hold their employers accountable. So, for example, if there had been union workers brought in here, they might not have agreed to work in these dangerous conditions because they would have said, this is going to make us sick, we're not going to do this. So what they were doing is really kind of exploiting these people who were, first off, not union workers, and second, were African Americans who were being brought from the South. So I mean, this wasn't even, these people weren't from West Virginia necessarily. They were being brought in from outside to do this kind of dirty, nasty job for very little money and with a lot of risks. So of course that makes it difficult when you want to come back around and kind of bring this legal case, because you're dealing with people who really did not have very many rights to begin with. And even if they legally may have had rights, I mean, this is still in the 30s, and these are African Americans. They're not going to be treated with as much respect or in the same way as, say, white union workers might be. So that's, I mean, that's kind of, we can sort of think about that in terms of these characters, kind of building up these characters, because we see a lot of different people, we hear a lot of different voices in these poems, but we don't necessarily know who they are. I mean, that's what, and I think that's kind of what distinctly makes this poetry, is that it's giving us these sort of brief images and little snippets of conversation without all these details, right? Like we would have seen in that video documentary, the little short video that we watched on Monday, where you get a lot of details, everything's very clearly spelled out. Okay, that's good. So I think let's go look at this a little bit more in depth. So, okay, we kind of talked about this a little bit. This is a lung disease. Silicate dust makes it. The dust causing the growth of, so that kind of is, we can sort of think of this as starting out, establishing things. We have a lung disease, it's caused by this silicate dust. Why do you think this first stanza just ends, the dust causing the growth of? Brianna?
I'm guessing it's gonna like describe it like in the next couple like pieces here, and then it's gonna go back and fix it again.
Right, so it's kind of, so there's, I mean, there isn't just one thing that it's necessarily affecting, right? So it could just say, the dust causing the growth of whatever. But it's a very complicated disease, right? As we've seen, I mean, there's not just one body part. It's not like dust causing the growth of a fingernail. It's causing all of these different things to happen throughout the body. So it's sort of setting us up to think of this huge effect, right? And it's just coming from one thing. I mean, we start off with dust. Again, it's this thing that doesn't necessarily seem very dangerous. Like here, we just think, there's a little speck of dust. You know, that doesn't seem like it could cause all these bodily harm, let alone growth, right? I mean, we're moving from this little teeny tiny speck to a disease that's going to end up taking over these people's bodies. So, okay, this X-ray picture taken last April, I would point out to you, these are the ribs, this is the region of the breastbone, this is the heart, a wide white shadow filled with blood. In here, of course, is the swallowing tube, esophagus, the windpipe, spaces between the lungs. Okay, so now we're starting to get all of these kind of different body parts and different things that it's affecting. But it's interesting because we're getting sort of, I mean, if we want to think of just like literally physically, this is the area. Are there any like anatomy, physiology people here who can help us with this? I'm not, I know that stuff's all more or less in here somewhere, but I think, so basically we're talking about this region. But it's not just something solid, remember? So we're kind of critiquing this idea of looking at the body as just this sort of self-contained thing. And we have all these different parts. Ribs, breastbone, heart, blood, esophagus, swallowing tube, windpipe. The spaces between the lungs, right? I mean, because we tend to think of, we just sort of have this list of body parts or this list of organs. But then within the body, there are all these sort of spaces between them. They're not all cut off from each other. It's this whole kind of system that's being affected. And so I think she's sort of trying to get us to see how the introduction of one little speck of dust, well, not just one little speck of dust, lots and lots and lots and lots. Because remember, I mean, they said some in smaller concentrations, the silicate dust is not necessarily going to have this effect, but in larger concentrations it will. But how something like just dust, something that we don't think of as very substantial, can affect in a lot of different ways sort of all these systems within our bodies. Between the ribs. So again, we have this kind of emphasis of these sort of spaces between, these kind of connections between. Between the ribs, so this is right, remember we have kind of a question and answer thing here. So we have to think of these as sort of two different characters. So one asking the questions and then one who's answering. Between the ribs, these are the collarbones. Now, this lung's modeled, beginning in these areas. You'd say a snowstorm had struck the fellow's lungs. About alike, that side and this side, top and bottom, the first stage in this period in this case. So this is kind of, we're looking at sort of one specific example here and kind of getting, again, more things. Ribs, collarbones, lungs. But at the same time, I mean, all of those things, so far it has this almost sort of cold, scientific vibe to it, right? I mean, is this necessarily poetry? Listing body parts and having a conversation? I mean, what is it? Clearly it is poetry. But what is something like, let's think particularly in this stanza, what is it that separates this and makes it not just an account of a conversation or a medical textbook? And there's not necessarily one thing, but let's just sort of think in general, what are the things that makes this uniquely poetry? Yeah. Yeah, right? So it's, I mean, would you trust a doctor who said, well, I'm afraid I have bad news. There's a snowstorm in your lungs and you're going to die soon. But that's not really a diagnosis, right? I mean, that's not very scientific. So that's right, this sort of this introduction of symbolism and imagery. What else makes this poetry? What about, think of in terms of the structure, right? I mean, the structure of a poem, we can kind of even see just on the page without even reading a poem, that it's a poem from the way it looks. So what kind of structural elements are there here that are different from other types of writing, or other ways of communicating these same ideas? Right, so it's put in stanzas first. And so what do you have to do when you put things in stanzas? What does that require? How do you have to change? Say that you're just looking at this as a dialogue. Maybe this is just a transcript from a court. How would you change that into a stanza? What are the ways that you might have to modify those details and make them different, but still, of course, true to what you're trying to talk about? Yeah?
Isn't it something about the syllables in each line, or the rhythm of each line has to match? Or if it has to be like uniform?
Right, I mean, in some poetry you get these very like metered kind of rhythms. In this, which is a little bit more freeform, it's not like everything's rhyming necessarily. But you're right, there's still something about the way that you read it, the rhythm that you read it, the way that it's written that makes you read it in almost kind of a different pace than you would read other things, right? So we have, let's just think about this. Between the ribs, these are the collarbones. We have these sort of short little sentences, just a couple of words, giving us this sort of bare outline of the image. We know between the ribs, these are the collarbones, but we don't necessarily say, have a doctor who's saying, well, in this x-ray we can look between the patient's ribs and see that the collarbones are located adjacent to the blah, 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 right? We don't have all those little details because we don't necessarily need them. The poem is kind of trying to give us more of this sort of atmospheric feeling rather than giving us kind of specific scientific details. So I think that's why we get these little sort of short, not necessarily explicitly connected things, but things that are sort of connected through the larger themes of the poem, right? So we also don't get things like, he said, or she said, like we would get in a novel, or so-and-so went up to the judge and did this, or they asked the minor to lift up his arms, or whatever. We don't get those little details that kind of in a novel will sort of tell us, what the characters look like, where they are. So in that sense, why would we not get those details? Because it's not to give us less information, right? I mean, they're not trying to trick us into anything. Why would having fewer details actually make us understand something more about this? Yeah. Right, I mean, it opens it up to many more interpretations. And it opens it up to sort of a more kind of personal understanding of it. You're not necessarily being told what to think. You're sort of being given these little things, and then it allows you to kind of recreate some of those images in your own mind. So I think that's sort of what makes poetry unique, is that it gives the reader a lot more freedom than in any other kind of writing to, I mean, if we kind of even want to think about this in a similar way, we're sort of thinking about bodies and environments being related. We could think of readers and poems being related in a very similar way. We become a part of the poem. The poem becomes a part of us. I mean, it sounds a little bit silly, but it's true. You really, with poetry, you're sort of really getting drawn into it. Even when it's not necessarily, even when it's kind of this scientific information and sort of scientific language, you can still express that stuff through poetry. Okay, so let's keep going. So now I have let us have the second. So now we're moving on to a second patient. Come to the window again. Here's the heart. More numerous nodules, thicker, see in the upper lobes. You will notice the increase. Here, streaked fibrous tissue. And so we're kind of still getting these more and more detailed. The heart, the nodules, upper lobes, fibrous tissue. We're kind of seeing more and more here now the kind of specific way that their bodies are being degraded. So let's see what all of this means. Indicating. So what does all this mean? Why the streaked fibrous tissue, for example? What does it mean to have that tissue? That indicates the progress in 10 months' time. And now this year, short breathing, solid scars, even over the ribs, thick on both sides, blood vessels shut, model conglomeration. So now we're starting to see, right, this sort of larger effect and kind of over time how it's changing these people's bodies. That, right, the progress in 10 months' time. And now we're kind of going out of the body again, right? Because we get short breathing. Well, I mean, that could be either in or out of the body. Because we think of, we can just look at a pair of lungs in an x-ray and see, okay, they're not capable of breathing that much. But at the same time, this is sort of a real, I mean, you see like old or sick people walking around and they're kind of huffing and puffing. And I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. So it's sort of taking us to, on the one hand, the experience that these people are having because of this, but on the other hand, also the sort of internal effects. What stage? So right now we're kind of moving and we're seeing sort of how this is progressing, how this is kind of slowly taking these people over and changing them. Third stage. Each time I place my pencil point, there and there and there, there. Okay, this part is very interesting. Because here, I mean, we're really not getting very much information at all. This is kind of confusing. It's like each time, there and there and there, there. What are they trying to get across through this? Because she's not giving us the details of what's there. Anybody, I want to let somebody else, if anybody else has any ideas. What are all these theirs? Anybody who hasn't talked? I don't want to keep you guys from talking, but I want to hear other people's thoughts too, and then I'll let you guys go. Do you have something? No? Yeah.
It's all over.
All over.
It's, I mean, like, when she's saying, like, she puts her pencil, like, there and there and there, like, the pencil's really small, and it's, like, everywhere, like, the whole thing.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. So yeah, I mean, it's like, we don't necessarily need to know what all of those theirs are. Just the fact that there's so many different places, right? Each time I place my pencil point, there and there, and that's at least these 5 different places. It's again showing that this dust and these things that are coming into their lungs, it's not just kind of one simple, easy problem, right? I mean, they can't just take a pill and make it go away. And I mean, this is the same, we see this with like other diseases too, like the way that things like cancer spreads, that it's becomes very complicated and it becomes very difficult to treat. And so I think, again, this is kind of showing us the nature, right? I mean, think back also, in sort of the larger scale. What's the title of this poem? The Disease, right? So I mean, this poem is kind of trying to get us to see, if the first poem was called West Virginia, it was kind of getting us to see the history of everything that happened in West Virginia, the sort of the first settlers meeting the Native Americans, trying to go over the Appalachian Mountains, and then the Civil War, and then industry coming in. So I mean, that was kind of giving us that background. So this poem, The Disease, this is sort of telling us what the nature of this disease is. That it's a very complicated disease. It's very hard to treat. It spreads throughout all these kind of systems in the body, and it involves things that are difficult to just sort of recognize in terms of how do you avoid this? How do you escape this dust? These things that are just in the air. Because what do? Do you just stop breathing? Hold your breath every time you go to work? You can't do that. And so it shows also then this kind of larger conflict between economic needs and health. Because, and we can kind of think of that on two scales, right? Because we have on the one hand the needs of these, probably very poor and desperate African American workers who are coming from the South and are just taking this job, right? I mean, that's what we saw in Grapes of Wrath, when they said, we don't want to get paid 15 cents an hour, and the kind of big fat cat guy in the car just says, well, you want to work or not? That's what I'm paying. So it's this sort of, on the one hand, this kind of desperation and need to make a living and need to support your family that these miners have. On the other hand, we see this sort of, increasing need of these big companies, right? Like these big conglomerates. The Kanawha River Power Company, I think is the name of the one, which this wasn't the only project that they had. That company was using these sort of rivers and the landscape and natural world around there to make a lot of money, right? And so you have then, on the other hand, these people who want to become very wealthy and don't particularly care how they do it. And so it kind of drives them to do things like this that may affect and hurt people, but they say, well, how else do you get it out of the ground? We have to do it one way or another. So you also have this sort of economic conflict of, on the one hand, very rich people who want to become much more rich by taking advantage of these natural resources, and at the same time, very poor people who just are trying to make a living. And so you have this kind of push and pull between those that also makes this very complicated. Okay. Now we move on to, obviously we're hearing something different. This is in quotes. It is growing worse every day. At night I get up to catch my breath. If I remained flat on my back, I believe I would die. So who do we think is speaking here? The diseased person, right? The sick miner, right? There's sort of, now we're really kind of getting out of that like scientific body, the sort of body part body, and we're getting the kind of personal body, right? We're hearing what this person's experience of this body is like. It's growing worse every day, right? Which we've already seen that. We've seen that it's growing worse. We've seen it going through these sort of medical stages, first stage, third stage, etc., 10 months progress. At night I get up to catch my breath. If I remain flat on my back, I believe I would die. So here we're getting actually kind of the same thing that we got with the testimony that we could sort of think of this kind of medical testimony before, right? This is the effect that, what's going on there? This is the effect that it has on these people's bodies. This is what it does to the different body parts. But now we're seeing the same thing, but just sort of from a different side. But it's still, they're talking about the same body. They're talking about the same person. And again, so this is sort of another example of how something like poetry is unique and different from something like scientific or medical literature, in that we get all of these different voices to give us all these kind of different sides and different aspects, different experiences of what this means. Okay, let's keep going. It gradually chokes off the air cells in the lungs. I'm trying to say it the best I can. That is what happens, isn't it? A choking off in the air cells? Yes. There's difficulty breathing? Yes. And a painful cough? Yes. Does silicosis cause death? Yes, sir. So who do we think is talking there? Is this still the patient? The miner? Right. I mean, because this sounds very different. This sounds like someone who does not want to talk, right? You say, I'm trying to say it the best I can, right? I mean, this sounds like somebody who's trying to come up with excuses for poisoning these people. So, and again, we don't know necessarily who this is. We aren't told who this is. But there's a different tone that we all of a sudden get, right? And even look at this. We know that it's a different person because in this stanza is bracketed in quotes, right? And the following one is not. So even that, just this, again, the way that the poem is structured, the way that she's putting some things in quotes and some things out of quotes, is giving us these little hints and clues as to what's going on, right? And so clearly we have on the one side somebody who we could think of as maybe a representative of the mining company, and on the other side probably the person who's representing the miners, right? Because they're trying to prove it gradually chokes off the air cells in the lungs. That is what happens, isn't it? A choking off in the air cells. So they're trying to say, they're trying to prove here in a kind of legal way. So now we've kind of gotten these poetic, scientific, medical, legal, historical, all these kind of different voices, right? Yes. And okay, so again, now he's kind of driven this person to the point of saying, okay, I can no longer deny what you're saying, but at the same time he's giving these very short answers. Yes, 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 right? Because you don't want to feel responsible for these things. A choking off in the air cells, difficulty breathing, painful cough. And I mean, finally we get to, does this cause death? That's what it's leading up to, right? Is that they're trying to show that this very complicated disease that starts off from little specks of dust, goes into people's lungs, affects all of these kind of respiratory systems, and eventually causes death. What she's trying to do here is take us through all of these links to get us to this sort of end point of what happens to these people. So there's a lot going on here, obviously, but I think all of these different voices are great and these sort of different perspectives because it's getting us to see these sort of different ways of describing and explaining these relationships between the body and the environment. So, okay, I don't think we have time to look at the next one, which we'll look on Friday, but does anybody have any more observations about this one or questions about this? Yeah?
Back up at the first stanza,
Uh-huh.
when you were talking about the of,
Yeah.
I was thinking that she wanted, or whoever wrote this wanted us to read it like, the dust causing the growth of. And I think she was applying it back to the lung disease. It says this is a lung disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the dust causing the growth of.
So it's kind of, so do you see it as sort of like a loop? Like it's kind of going full circle somehow?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of, right, we kind of start off with that and then sort of come back to the beginning, right? And now, and yeah, I mean, now that we've gone through the whole poem, we really see, right, what that, looking at this again, thank you for bringing this back up, because it shows us all of what that growth of is, right? So that's sort of the starting point that she wants us to see is, how do all of these things grow? What are they? By the end, and then of course to the end we get death, which is also interesting, right? Because then it's sort of, in that same kind of Whitman way, this balance between growth and death, even through those imageries of how the poem begins and how it ends. But like you say, if it is kind of a circle thing, we see that again in Whitman, this sort of circle from life to death, which obviously we feel a little bit less sympathetic here, because it's not just sort of a natural disease or bacteria. I mean, it's, you know, people who have put these people in danger and furthermore put them in danger for their own personal profit. So there's a lot to think about here. So keep thinking about this. On Friday, again, papers will be due, and we'll be looking at the last poem. So I'll see you guys then. Have a good day. Reminder, office hours 12:30 to 1:30, Humanities 416. If you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you guys Wednesday.
Wednesday? Friday.
Friday. Today is Wednesday. Sorry.
I was about to say, today better not be Monday. So basically, hey, Jeremy,
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
do you happen to have a paper for launching?
I don't. Sorry. Oh, Bren. Oh no, I give you your paperback. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's the one for.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for bringing this in. Thank you.
Hello, Jeremy.
Have a good one. I was trying to record my lecture so I could watch it today. Don't worry, I didn't record you guys.